Okay, so we're going to be working with some periodic functions again, and we had a whole video, the last video, on how to find period and amplitude and things like that, and also the midline. So I'm not going to go too far into the exact lesson of that. We are going to be doing that, but we're not going to be teaching that in this video. Please go back to that video and look at that to figure out some of the things that I'm doing if you're a little bit lost. Now, if we look at this, we have y equals sine of theta in this first box right over here, and we have cosine, or y equals cosine of theta in this second box over here, and they look very similar to each other. But if you notice from last video, they are both periodic functions, which makes this really easy to apply the last lesson. Now, the domain is always going to be all real numbers when it comes to sine and cosine, because it's just going to be doing that forever. The range is a little bit different than what we've been used to. Notice that it's only going down to -1, and the highest value is going to be 1. So you're going to say y such that y is between -1 and 1, and that makes sense. The amplitude, as we can see, the middle line is going to be right at 0, so the amplitude is just going to be 1. And the period, if we follow it, stops at 360 degrees. We'd start here and go 360 degrees. And it looks like this is going to be the same thing, even though it looks a little bit different. Now, there's a couple cool functions down here. Notice that we sometimes have a number that's in front of the trig function. And then we also sometimes have a number that is in front of the angle that goes inside of the trig function. Now, these two things make it really easy to find our amplitude and period. Our amplitude is going to be whatever the absolute value of that beginning number is, and our period, if we use our b value here, is just going to be 360 or 2 pi over the absolute value of b. So we're going to be using those a lot to be able to figure out whatever our amplitude and period are. Alright, so we have example 1 here. Now, in our last video, we were looking pretty much just at the graphs to figure out what our midline, amplitude, and period are. So we should be able to still do that right now. If we look, our midline is going to be at 0 because it's going up to 4 and down to -4. So our amplitude is going to be 4. But another way of looking at that is looking at the actual equation itself. If we look at the equation and we realize that 4 is in front of that trig value, that is going to be our a value. Our general form, well, our almost general form of a trig function is going to be y equals a, the trig function, we'll say cosine right now, of b times theta, theta being our angle that we are graphing, and that's going to be inside of the trig function. So our a value is 4, that means our amplitude is 4, and that's kind of cool because our amplitude is going to equal whatever the absolute value of our a is, which makes it really kind of convenient to show what our amplitude is. So our amplitude is going to equal 4. Now our period, if we look at the graph, might be a little bit harder to figure out because we don't actually have a notch there telling us exactly where it is. If we start up here and we go down to figure out the full cycle, you'll realize there's nothing there. So we're going to have to figure something else out. We would have to find out where it lies on two things and divide it, and it seems really, really complicated to look at the graph and figure this out, and it is. But there is a way to figure this out. Notice the b value is going to be in front of the theta. Our b value is 3. Now we have a really nice formula on the last page, and that's going to be our period is going to equal 360 or 2 pi divided by our absolute value of whatever our b is. So since our b is 3, we can say our period equals 360 divided by 3. Let's ask Siri, Hey Siri, what is 360 divided by 3?
The answer is 120.
Okay, our period is going to be equal to 120, and that totally makes sense because just looking at it, we can tell that our period is going to be bigger than 90, but less than 180. So it makes sense that our period equals 120. All right, so you guys are going to give this a shot now. You guys are going to try and figure out what our amplitude and period is of these two trig functions. Now, you will not be given the graph, but if you want the graph, you can just go ahead and graph it on Desmos and you'll be able to actually see the thing. Good job for pausing the video and trying this out yourself. So let's try and figure this out, and we're not going to graph it because we have all the information right here to help us out. I'm going to write down my general forms of the equation right now, or my almost general forms of the equation right now. This is going to be y equals a cosine of b theta, whereas my sine function is going to be y equals a sine of b theta. So now I can figure out my amplitude. Remember, my amplitude is just going to be my absolute value of a. So my a in this case, oh no, there isn't anything. What do we do when there's nothing multiplying the thing that we're trying to find? Well, that's going to be 1. How do we know it's 1? Well, if we stick a 1 in front of this cosine, nothing changes, and that's exactly what we want. It's not going to be 0, because if we did 0 in front of there and multiplied 0 times cosine 1/2 theta, that would be 0, and it changes the whole thing. So we want something there that's not going to change anything. So in this case, a, or our amplitude, is going to equal 1. Now, our period might be a little bit harder to figure out because we have a fraction, but let's go ahead and try to figure this out anyways. Our period is going to equal 360 because we're still working with degrees for some reason, divided by our absolute value of our b. So that's going to be, our period is going to be 360 divided by 1/2. Now, how do we do that? Now, there is a nice way of doing that. You could just flip it on top and it turns out to be 360 times 2. But we could just type this into our Desmos and not have to do the mental straining to try and figure this out ourselves. 360 divided by. Now, at this point, I want to hit divided by again. Notice that I have two fractions, one on the top and one on the bottom. And the one on the bottom is smaller, which means that I'm going to be dividing by a fraction. And I will put 1 over 2 here. So 360 divided by 1/2 equals 720. If you know how to do that by hand, by all means, just do it by hand. Back to our lesson means that our period will equal 720, which means that it's going to take 720 units for it to complete a full cycle. Now let's try and figure out our 1b here. Again, our amplitude is just going to equal the absolute value of a. This is going to become the easiest thing that you've ever done, and you're just going to say our amplitude equals 3. Our period is going to equal 360 degrees divided by our absolute value of b, and that means that our period is going to be 360 divided by 5. What is 360 divided by 5?
That would be 72.
So our period is going to equal 72. Very good.